Joining me now is former diplomat and self-proclaimed candidate for vice president, Jim Jatras. Jim, thanks for being here.
Hi, Liz. Thank you.
All right, we saw this kid pleading for his life. It's been all over the news. Jim, what exactly did he do?
Well, according to some of the video that's been broadcast by the media, he took down a propaganda sign. Evidently, he wanted to keep as a souvenir. Human Rights Watch called this a college-age prank, but I don't think the North Koreans are very appreciative of pranks.
Now, you say he wanted to keep it as a souvenir. So was he intending to steal it, somewhat like we'll steal shampoo bottles from hotel rooms in different cities that we stay in? Or was it a crime, as in, if you steal a political sign here in America, it's technically a crime, too?
I think it was more of the former, or maybe that's the way he regarded it. But remember, this is probably the world's foremost totalitarian state, and they saw it as an attack against the security and the interests of the Korean state. So they are treating this as a very serious offense. But that, I think, says more about the uniquely repressive nature of North Korea than it does about Mr. Warmbier's intentions.
Clearly, because they sentenced him to 15 years of hard labor. I mean, Jim, that's essentially a death sentence, right?
It really is, given the state of their prisons. Now, hopefully he won't serve anything like that. If there's some kind of deal to get him out, the North Koreans have seized about a dozen Americans in the last 20 years or so. They generally don't hold them more than a few months, although there have been a couple of exceptions.
Well, what's the U.S. doing to try to free him? I know there's some rumors that Governor John Kasich of Ohio has been working behind the scenes. There have been some other politicians who've made comments, but what's actively happening that we can't see right now?
Well, there are going to be talks between the American government and the North Korean government to try to find out politically what do the North Koreans really want out of this. You have to put this in the context of the ballistic missile launches they've been doing in recent weeks, the sanctions that were imposed by the UN Security Council, unilateral sanctions then imposed by President Obama. He's really a pawn, obviously, in a diplomatic game here, and I think that's where the action's going to be. You mentioned Governor Kasich, former New Mexico Governor Bill Richardson is involved. The only thing missing right now is Dennis Rodman.
Maybe they'll call him in if it gets to that. What do you think North Korea does want? You mentioned some ballistic missiles. We know they've been shooting those off. They're probably following the footsteps of Iran. But what do you see them accepting as a deal to help free this kid?
Well, I think there's a lot they want from us. What they would clearly like would be diplomatic recognition and some kind of a security agreement that guarantees their status, especially now that they have nuclear weapons. That's a pretty tall order. I don't think it's going to happen, and I don't know if there are going to be some smaller steps that could be achieved. But, there is an element of extortion here. And the flip side of that is that with their missile launches and the imposition of new sanctions, they're actually in some ways making them themselves more isolated from what they seem to want as their objectives.
Now, there have been a lot of different leaders around the world who've called for the release of Warmbier on humanitarian grounds. But this sentence, while it is extremely excessive and probably a death sentence, like we mentioned, it's not a violation of international law, is it?
No, not really. I can think of any number of countries, including, say, Saudi Arabia, which is one of our best friends, where some fairly innocuous things could get you some pretty nasty punishments. So the fact that something is way out of line in terms of, let's say, the equity of the sentence for the alleged offense is not something that would have international implications, although we would see this as a political pretext and a terrible violation of human rights.
Right. Is that why the government then recommends that American citizens not travel to North Korea, because they know that North Korea is basically just waiting to take Americans hostage so that they can have pawns for their games against the American government?
That's right. And this is where I think we have a little bit of a failure of leadership in our overall policy toward North Korea. I mean, here we are, 60 years after the Korean War, 25 years after communism ceased to be a big global presence. And we still have 29,000 troops on the DMZ, which are there essentially as a tripwire to be exterminated in the case of a war, so that we'll be committed. And you do have to wonder, are we just upping the ante? Why North Korea is so obsessed in its way with the United States, rather than this being the problem of the Chinese, the Russians, the Japanese, and of course the South Koreans, whose immediate neighborhood this is?
Well, why do you think, in your opinion, why are the North Koreans so obsessed with our country, with destroying our country, with branding everything and everyone who comes from our country as evil?
I think partly it's because we have been stuck in a time warp since the Korean War, where this is essentially a confrontation between the United States and North Korea, with, of course, China backing them up. And from China's point of view, I think rather understandably, they see the United States as allied with South Korea. That is 40 times the GDP of North Korea, twice its population. But for some reason, it's our job to defend South Korea against North Korea rather than the South Koreans' job. So I think we need to be looking at what do we do to incentivize not really so much North Korea, but China to essentially abandon a regime that, frankly, they have very little love for themselves, but they don't want to see an American presence on their border on the Yalu River.
All right, Jim, we're running out of time. I do want to ask you one last question, though. Critics are saying that Obama's deal with Iran regarding the hostages there a couple months back is encouraging nations like North Korea to hold our citizens hostage because Iran got such the better end of that bargain. Do you see that to be the same way?
I think there's an element of truth there. Let's face it, Liz. Every country in the world says we don't negotiate with terrorists, we don't negotiate with hostage takers, and they all do. And everybody knows this. As far as the Iranian deal, I think the North Koreans certainly are aware of that. They would like to get the same sort of recognition and concessions as Iran got. The trouble is Iran got that as a state that is committed not to building nuclear weapons, whereas the North Koreans want a recognition of themselves as a weapons state, sort of like India and Pakistan are. And of course, the North Koreans looked at the fate of the other member of the axis of evil, Iraq, and say to themselves, if we give up our nuclear weapons, we're going to end up like that. And so I don't see an easy way out of this impasse.
Right. I think the way I see this situation is I see North Korea with an end game of wanting a nuclear deal like Obama negotiated with Iran. I see this as being their first step. They're almost following in the footsteps of all the different things that Iran did in order to negotiate that. And the hostage negotiation goes right in line with that. So I think that's their end goal. That's why I'm going to be so interested to see how the Obama administration handles this situation with a kid there now, because I think it's not going to be quite as easy as it has been in the past, because North Korea has reason to believe that Obama will cave because he did with Iran.